Tonight, we're settling into something a little quieter, a little older, and honestly, a little shinier than usual. So if you're lying there trying to find that one comfortable dent in your pillow, or maybe staring at the ceiling pretending you're not mentally replaying every embarrassing thing you've ever done, don't worry. We're going to glide right past all that. Because tonight, we're drifting into the soft, metallic glow of medieval craftsmanship. Specifically, the strange, almost mythical stuff known as Damascus steel, the metal that looked like someone trapped smoke inside iron and then used it to slice through history. So go ahead and loosen your shoulders. Dim whatever light source is still refusing to leave you alone, and let's start floating through the story of the material that medieval warriors admired, Renaissance collectors hoarded, and modern scientists keep poking with increasingly confused expressions. Let's begin, very slowly. The first thing to know about Damascus steel is that it wasn't actually made in Damascus. Classic case of medieval branding. Someone stamped the name, it stuck, and now we just roll with it. Sort of like if future historians found a Starbucks cup in your room and assumed all early 21st century cities were named Tall Caramel Macchiato. Damascus steel came from a specific kind of high-carbon steel called wootz, mostly produced in India and Sri Lanka. And yes, wootz sounds like a medieval attempt at slang that never quite caught on. But despite the goofy name, the stuff had an almost mystical reputation. Travelers described it with breathless admiration, usually saying something like, "It cuts through iron," and also your expectations. But here's the sleepy twist. The real magic wasn't one dramatic discovery. It was a slow, centuries-long, kind of accidental collaboration between miners, smiths, traders, and people who just wanted a nice sword without it snapping in half. Nothing exciting, just the quiet hum of craftsmanship, passed from generation to generation. Exactly the kind of boring we like. A sword that behaved itself. So what made Damascus steel special? The famous watered pattern, of course. Those rippling lines across the blade that looked like the aftermath of someone dragging their fingers through fresh paint. Very aesthetic, very Pinterest-worthy. But the reason medieval nobles kept drooling over it had less to do with looks and more to do with performance. Damascus steel had this unusual combination of hardness and flexibility. It could slice, it could bend, and it could hold an edge far longer than the poor, overworked swords made in most of Europe at the time. European knights were basically running around with medieval bargain bin steel compared to this stuff. Imagine showing up to a duel with your clunky iron club disguised as a sword, and the other guy unsheaths something that looks like liquid moonlight and cuts clean through a shield. Yeah, that's the emotional damage level we're working with. But remember, we're keeping this sleepy, so let's glide past the battlefield. Instead, picture some medieval merchant in a dusty robe, holding up a Damascus blade to the sun, watching those wavy patterns shimmer like quiet ocean currents. Admiration without adrenaline. Exactly our vibe. Floating back to the source. To understand where this super material came from, we drift back to India around 300 BCE to 300 CE. Somewhere between monarchs collapsing under the weight of their jewelry and philosophers debating metaphysics, local metalworkers were quietly melting iron with carefully selected carbon sources, usually plant material, sometimes charcoal, occasionally whatever was lying around in the workshop that day. From this came wootz ingots, little pucks of steel so famous that they traveled across Asia and the Middle East, eventually becoming the raw material for Damascus blades. Picture a trader slowly rowing a boat across the Indian Ocean with a pile of unassuming metal lumps. No fanfare, no Indiana Jones theme, Just a man, some waves, and a cargo that would eventually inspire centuries of sword envy. Once those ingots reached the Middle East, local smiths heated, hammered, cooled, reheated, mumbled a few complaints, and hammered again until a pattern emerged. That's when they'd nod to themselves, probably sweating, probably questioning their life choices, and say, "Yep, this one won't embarrass me." And thus, a legend was born. The secret that wasn't really a secret. People like to say Damascus steel was made using a lost secret, as if medieval smiths hid their recipes in a locked chest and then everyone forgot where they put it. The reality is much quieter and much on brand for this channel. The secret was lost, accidentally, gradually, like your motivation on a Monday morning. It turns out, Damascus steel relied on a long chain of very specific conditions, particular ores containing trace elements like vanadium, charcoal with just the right impurities, and forging temperatures controlled by eyeballing the color of the metal, and a level of patience that would make a monk look impulsive. Remove even one of these ingredients, and the whole delicate process fell apart. And over centuries, that's exactly what happened. Trade routes shifted, mines ran out, empires collapsed, the usual stuff. Every time a source disappeared or a workshop closed, another tiny thread of the Damascus tapestry unraveled. By the 1800s and 1900s, Europeans were desperately trying to reverse engineer the pattern. They poked it, filed it, boiled it, etched it with acid, basically everything except politely asking it to reveal its secrets. But the real answer wasn't a single trick. It was a slow, complicated chain reaction of minerals, metallurgy, and human stubbornness. A secret that was never meant to be a secret, just fragile. Let's drift into the science softly. Modern researchers love studying Damascus steel, mostly because it makes no sense and refuses to behave like normal metal. Scientists have put it under microscopes expecting a basic, boring structure and instead found layers of carbon nanotubes and cementite nanowires, which is kind of embarrassing when you remember medieval blacksmiths discovered this by poking a furnace with tongs and saying things like, looks hot enough. Picture a lab full of physicists staring at a blade forged by a man who had no concept of atomic structure, but somehow created tiny, self-assembling nanomaterials because his charcoal just happened to be the right kind of tree. That's the sort of cosmic irony that lets us all sleep a little easier. The myth-making phase. Of course, the more mysterious Damascus steel became, the more dramatic the legends got. Knights claimed it could cut a silk scarf floating in midair. Chroniclers said it sliced through other swords as though they were butter, which, given medieval butter's rock-like consistency, might not be entirely inaccurate. Some stories even claimed the blades could cut through stone, which is adorable in a my dad can beat your dad kind of way. But no, they could not. Even the best steel does not take requests from granite. But it didn't matter. The myths stuck, and the more vanished the secret became, the shinier the legends grew. History loves a little exaggeration, just enough to make things interesting, but not enough to wake you up. The slow fade into obscurity. By the 18th and 19th centuries, the world finally lost Damascus steel. Not dramatically, just quietly. Workshops closed, materials ran out, smiths grew old, apprentices moved on to newer, easier methods that didn't require memorizing the exact shade of glowing orange metal at 800 degrees C. Industrialization came along and said, hey, what if instead of spending 20 years perfecting one sword, we make 10,000 identical ones in a month? And people nodded and said, yeah, that sounds great. And Damascus steel was politely escorted out of the room. It was never truly forgotten. Swords survived in museums, travelers wrote about them, collectors bragged about owning them. But the metallurgical choreography behind them was gone. The world moved on, as it always does. and Damascus steel became a shimmering memory. A gentle pause before part 2. So that's where we'll leave things for now. Damascus steel, born in ancient furnaces, carried across continents, celebrated for centuries, then softly fading into legend.